Picture this. You're in the Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most expensive warship ever built, $13 billion of steel, aviation fuel, and American resolve. The radar lights up. Not one contact. Not two. A salvo of ballistic missiles, inbound, traveling at 10 times the speed of sound. Your fighter jets are still on the deck. Your escorts are already calculating intercept probabilities. And the number they're coming back with is not good. Here's what nobody at the Pentagon wants to say out loud: the aircraft carrier, the single most powerful symbol of American military dominance for 80 years, may no longer be safe to send into a real war. This is not a story about defense budget cuts. This is not about political decisions in Washington. This is not about one missile or one adversary. This is about whether the United States Navy can actually project power in the Western Pacific without putting 100,000 tons of steel, and 5,000 American sailors, inside a kill zone. And there's one event most people have never heard of. A war game. A simulation conducted right here in the United States, in 2002. A retired Marine general was handed a simple task: attack a carrier strike group using unconventional tactics. What happened next was so embarrassing that the Pentagon buried the results. We'll get to that. But first, you need to understand what made the carrier untouchable in the first place. For most of the 20th century, if you wanted to know what America's foreign policy looked like, you looked at a carrier. When North Korea fired on a U.S. reconnaissance plane in 1969, President Nixon sent the USS Enterprise. When Iran held American hostages in 1979, 2 carrier strike groups moved into the Arabian Sea. When China started firing missiles near Taiwan in 1996, the USS Nimitz sailed through the Taiwan Strait. The message was always the same: here is a floating airfield the size of a small city, carrying 80 aircraft and 5,000 sailors, and there is nothing you can do about it. That message worked. For decades, it worked. Because nobody had a weapon that could actually threaten a carrier on the open ocean. Submarines could try. Anti-ship cruise missiles had limited range. But a carrier strike group, surrounded by destroyers, submarines, and its own combat air patrol, was considered effectively invulnerable. Stay with me on this, because this is where the math starts to break down. The F/A-18 Super Hornet, the primary strike aircraft on every American carrier, has a combat radius of roughly 500 miles. That means to strike a target, your carrier has to be within 500 miles of the coastline. Remember that number. 500 miles. In 2012, China officially unveiled the Dongfeng 21D. The Western press called it the Carrier Killer. That name is not an exaggeration. The DF-21D is the world's first ballistic missile specifically designed to hit a moving ship at sea. It flies at Mach 10, 10 times the speed of sound. It has a range of 1,500 kilometers. That's 930 miles. You do the math. Your carrier has to be within 500 miles to strike. Their missile reaches out to 930 miles. That gap, 430 miles of open ocean, is where American naval strategy starts to come apart. But it gets more complicated. The DF-21D doesn't fly in a straight line. It arcs up into the upper atmosphere, then comes screaming down at a near-vertical angle. Traditional naval defense systems, the Aegis radar, the standard missile interceptors, were designed to handle threats coming in horizontally, at sea level. A near-vertical, hypersonic re-entry vehicle is a fundamentally different problem. According to analysis published by the U.S. Naval Institute, no current carrier defense system has been tested and proven against a real-world DF-21D attack profile. Not one. Now before we go further, If you find this kind of deep dive analysis useful, consider subscribing. We cover the weapons, the strategy, and the decisions that most defense channels never touch. Hit the subscribe button, and you won't miss what's coming next. Because what China built after the DF-21D makes that missile look like a warning shot. The DF-21D was just the beginning. In 2015, China revealed the Dongfeng 26. The DF-26. Range, 4,000 kilometers. 2,485 miles. American military planners gave it a nickname immediately, the Guam Killer. Because Guam, the U.S. territory in the Western Pacific that hosts major Air Force and Navy installations, now sits comfortably within range. Think about what that means. The United States can no longer guarantee that its forward bases in the Pacific are safe. And if your bases aren't safe, your ability to sustain a carrier in the region becomes dramatically more complicated. Here's what the Pentagon won't say publicly: China has spent the last 20 years building what strategists call an anti-access/area denial network. Imagine a dome of radar systems, land-based missile batteries, submarines, and surveillance satellites stretching out from the Chinese coastline for 1,500 miles in every direction. Inside that dome, a carrier strike group doesn't project power. Inside that dome, a carrier strike group is a target. The RAND Corporation, one of the most respected defense think tanks in the United States, published a report in 2016 titled War with China, Thinking Through the Unthinkable. Their conclusion was not comfortable reading for Navy planners. RAND assessed that in a conflict over Taiwan, Chinese anti-access capabilities could prevent the United States from achieving air superiority over the strait within the first week of combat. Not because American technology is inferior. Because the geography and the missile math simply don't favor a carrier-centric approach anymore. And here's the part most analysts miss. China has been watching. Every carrier deployment, every exercise, every publicly available detail about how a carrier strike group operates, Beijing has been studying it for 30 years. The DF-21D was not built in a vacuum. It was built as a direct answer to the USS Nimitz sailing through the Taiwan Strait in 1996. That moment humiliated China. And China spent the next 2 decades making sure it would never happen again. Now. That war game I mentioned at the beginning. 2002. The U.S. military ran its largest war simulation in history, Millennium Challenge 2002. The blue team was the United States, equipped with the most advanced carrier strike group technology available. The red team was commanded by retired Marine Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper, playing an unnamed adversary in the Persian Gulf. Van Riper didn't try to win conventionally. He used motorcycle couriers instead of radio communications to avoid electronic surveillance. He used small, fast boats. He used pre-planned lighting signals from buildings along the coast. And in the opening hours of the exercise, he launched a massive, simultaneous, coordinated strike. He sank 16 ships, including multiple carriers, in a matter of hours. The Pentagon stopped the exercise. They reset the simulation. They gave the blue team advance warning of attacks. They literally refloated the sunken ships and restarted, with new rules that guaranteed the carrier strike group would survive. Van Riper resigned from the exercise in protest. The results were classified. The lessons were ignored. That was 2002. Before the DF-21D. Before the DF-26. Before China built artificial islands in the South China Sea and armed them with anti-ship missile batteries. Here's what this means for the world right now. If a crisis erupts over Taiwan tomorrow, and that is no longer a hypothetical question, the United States faces a decision no American president has ever had to make in the modern era. Do you send a carrier into the Taiwan Strait, knowing it is now inside China's kill zone? Do you risk 5,000 sailors and $13 billion of hardware on a show of force that might not be a deterrent anymore? Or do you hold back, and signal to every American ally in the Pacific that the guarantee you've been making for 80 years, may no longer be good? The Navy doesn't say this in press conferences. But they're saying it in procurement decisions. The new long-range anti-ship missile. The unmanned carrier-based aircraft programs. The push toward distributed maritime operations, spreading forces out instead of concentrating them on one massive hull. These are not upgrades. These are admissions. So here's where we land. First, the technology gap is real. The DF-21D and DF-26 have fundamentally changed the geometry of naval warfare. The carrier's greatest strength, its ability to project air power from the sea, now requires it to operate inside a missile envelope it cannot reliably defeat. Second, the strategic deterrent is weakening. For 80 years, sending a carrier was a message that ended conversations. Today, in the Western Pacific, that same message might start a war the carrier cannot survive the opening hours of. Third, and this is the part that should keep you up at night, the United States has not fought a peer adversary since World War II. Every carrier deployment since then has been against enemies without the ability to seriously threaten the ship itself. China is not that enemy. And the decisions America makes about carrier strategy in the next 5 years will determine whether it can credibly defend Taiwan, defend its Pacific alliances, and maintain the kind of naval dominance it has held since 1945. The carrier isn't dead. But it is no longer untouchable. And there's a difference between a weapon that projects power, and a weapon that has become a liability. Do you think the U.S. military is adapting fast enough to China's naval buildup in the Pacific? Drop your answer in the comments, I read every single one. The ocean hasn't changed. But the rules of who owns it have.